There is a quiet divide in rural America, and it shows up whenever someone opens a truck console or a bedside safe. For a long time, the answer to property defense and woods carry was simple, loud, and built of steel. But today, a younger generation looks at those heavy six-shooters and sees a slow-loading relic. They see a gun that kicks too hard and gets outclassed by a modern 9mm holding 15 rounds. Yet many older shooters still bet their lives on that same revolver, trusting old-school stopping power over high capacity. That leaves us with a real problem. When you live miles from the nearest paved road, you cannot carry a gun just for nostalgia. You need to know if that stubborn confidence is actually justified, or if it is blinding people to better tools. The .357 Magnum is not just a caliber anymore. It is a line in the sand. To understand why it still starts arguments, we have to look at the most misunderstood icon in its history. When you bring up the .357 Magnum in any crowded room, the very first gun that comes to mind is almost always the Colt Python. It is the expensive legend, the revolver that built the modern mythology of this caliber. For decades, it was considered the absolute pinnacle of American revolver manufacturing. The vent rib barrel, the deep royal blue finish, the unmistakable profile, and that notoriously smooth trigger pull made it a status symbol. People bought them to show off, to collect, and to admire. If you want to understand the old-school confidence that older shooters have in this cartridge, you have to look at the Python. It represents a time when a revolver was not just a tool, but a piece of mechanical art. The hand-fitted action feels like a Swiss watch. The weight of the gun absorbs the heavy recoil beautifully. When you hold a Python, you feel invincible. It makes you believe that 6 rounds are absolutely all you will ever need to handle any problem on your property. But here is the problem with that mindset, and it is a problem that rural gun owners run into immediately. A tool is only useful if you are actually willing to use it like a tool. And the Colt Python is simply too expensive and too pretty to be a practical working gun for the average guy. If you are checking fence lines in the rain, tossing a gun into the center console of a dusty farm truck, or dragging it through the brush to check on livestock, the last thing you want to worry about is scratching the finish on a collector piece. You find yourself babying the gun instead of treating it like the defensive tool it is supposed to be. That is the hard truth about the Python. It built the reputation of the .357 Magnum, but it has largely been retired from active duty. Older shooters remember it fondly, but younger shooters look at it and see a museum piece, not a daily driver. The lockwork is notoriously complex and fragile compared to modern designs. If it goes out of time, you cannot just fix it on your workbench with basic punches. You need a specialized gunsmith, and those are getting harder to find. It is a beautiful machine, but beauty does not stop a threat in the middle of the night, and beauty does not survive a rough life on a working ranch. The current production Colt Pythons have a manufacturer-suggested retail price around $1,499, and you will usually see them selling right around that same mark in stores, while older legacy models fetch well over $2,000 or $3,000 on the used market. That price tag alone pushes most practical shooters right out the door to look for something that can actually take a beating. If the legendary Colt is too expensive to scratch up on the farm, the logical next step is to find something built like a tank, something small enough to carry every single day. That brings us to the Ruger SP101. On paper, it seems to solve every problem we just talked about. It is small, made of heavy stainless steel, has no fragile lockwork, and you do not care if it gets banged around in the tractor cab. It is the ultimate expression of the small revolver with a big attitude. For folks living out in the country, the SP101 looks like the perfect answer. You can drop it in a heavy coat pocket, wear it on your belt while doing chores, or stash it in a toolbox. It promises all the legendary stopping power of the caliber, but in a package you will actually take with you when you walk out the door. But this is exactly where the argument takes a very sharp, painful turn. This is the small revolver with a massive, unavoidable problem. That problem is simple physics. When you take a high-pressure, incredibly concussive round and stuff it into a short-barreled, compact frame, the resulting recoil and muzzle blast are absolutely punishing. This is the mistake so many people make. They buy the SP101 because they want that old-school confidence in a small package. They take it out to the back pasture, load up 5 rounds of full-house heavy defensive hollow points, and squeeze the trigger. The noise is deafening, the fireball is blinding, and the gun snaps back into their palm like a hammer strike. After one cylinder, they put the gun down. You know exactly what happens next. They go back to the store, buy a box of light .38 special target loads, and that is all they ever shoot through the gun from that day forward. They carry a Magnum, but they load it with a much weaker round because the heavy stuff is too harsh to control. If you cannot shoot accurately under stress because you are flinching from the pain, then all that legendary power is wasted. An older shooter with arthritis is going to have a miserable time trying to control the SP101 with real defensive loads. It demands grip strength and recoil tolerance that many simply do not want to deal with, especially when modern compact pistols offer less recoil and hold twice as many rounds. The heavy double-action trigger makes it harder to stay on target when your hands are cold. The SP101 is built to last 3 lifetimes, but it is a harsh teacher that forces you to compromise on the power you bought it for. You can find a new Ruger SP101 with a retail price of around $859, though street prices tend to hover right around the $750 mark. And while that is a fair price for tough steel, that brutal recoil makes folks wonder if they should be shooting this cartridge out of a longer barrel instead. Now, before we look at what happens when you put this round into a rifle, I need you to think about something. We have been talking about handguns so far, but the entire argument over the .357 Magnum completely flips upside down the moment you introduce a longer barrel and a wooden stock. The next gun changes all the rules, and it is the exact reason why so many guys refuse to give up this caliber, even when modern semi-automatics try to push it out of the picture. We have seen the safe queen and we have felt the pain of the snub nose. But now we step into the lever gun debate. When you move away from handguns and look at the Marlin 1894C or the Henry Big Boy, .357 Magnum stops being a controversial pistol round and becomes one of the most brilliant rural tools ever invented. For decades, the concept of having a revolver on your hip and a lever-action rifle in your scabbard, both taking the exact same ammunition, has been the ultimate ranch logic. It makes logistics incredibly simple. You only need to buy one type of box off the hardware store shelf. But the real magic happens when you fire this cartridge out of a 16 or 20-inch rifle barrel. All of that terrible muzzle blast and punishing recoil we saw with the short revolver completely disappears. Out of a lever gun, a heavy Magnum load feels like a gentle push against your shoulder. It is incredibly friendly for older shooters or anyone who wants power without pain. Plus, that longer barrel gives the bullet a massive increase in velocity. A round already known for stopping power suddenly hits with the force of a true brush gun, making it highly capable of taking down deer, hogs, or predators at close to medium ranges around the property. The lever action itself is mechanically reliable and manually operated, meaning it is not picky about whether you feed it hot Magnum loads or light .38 special cowboy loads. It cycles them all. A lever gun is socially acceptable, looks like a traditional hunting tool, and does not draw unwanted attention in the truck. But the lever gun debate is fierce for a very good reason. That reason is purpose. The guys who oppose this setup will look at you and ask a very simple, grounded question. If you were going to take the time to shoulder a long gun, why in the world would you limit yourself to a pistol cartridge? If you need a rifle to do rifle work, why not carry a .30-30, a .223, or a .308? True rifle rounds will reach out hundreds of yards further and handle threats that a pistol bullet simply cannot touch. Critics argue that the pistol caliber lever gun is driven more by cowboy nostalgia than by modern reality. Yes, sharing ammo sounds great, but in a real emergency on the farm, you do not want to be shooting at a coyote 200 yards away with a bullet that drops like a rock past 100 yards. The lever gun forces you to accept a severe limitation on range just for the convenience of using the same box of ammo as your revolver. Furthermore, loading a tubular magazine one round at a time is slow, and clearing a malfunction from a lever action under stress is complicated. You have to honestly ask yourself if you are romanticizing the past at the expense of true capability. You can generally find a new Henry Big Boy or a Marlin 1894 with a retail price between $950 and $1,100, with street prices usually landing right around the $900 mark. But even if you love the lever action, the real heart of the argument still lives inside the heavy frame duty revolvers. Before we go higher, I want to know where you stand on this. Would you trust the older proven design, or would you still take the newer platform if things got ugly? If we are going to look at what older rural shooters really trust, we have to move past the rifles and look at the absolute workhorses of the revolver world. When someone says they carry a Magnum for stopping power, they are almost always picturing something like the Smith Wesson 686 or the Ruger GP100. These are the medium to heavy frame revolvers that were built specifically to solve the exact problem we saw with those small carry guns. If the little snub nose makes the Magnum too painful to shoot, these heavy steel duty guns tame it into something you can actually practice with and master. For decades, these were the gold standard for law enforcement, and today, they are the undeniable champions of farm carry and property defense. The engineering behind both the 686 and the GP100 is focused entirely on durability and recoil management. They feature full underlugs, which means the barrel has extra steel running all the way down to the muzzle. That extra weight hanging out front acts like a counterweight, pulling the muzzle down when the gun fires. Suddenly, that punishing recoil that bruised your hand before is soaked up by the mass of the gun. You can load a cylinder full of 158-grain hollow points and actually shoot a decent group without flinching. The actions are smooth, the sights are clear and adjustable, and the guns are heavy enough to double as a hammer if you really had to use them that way. But this is exactly where the .357 Magnum argument hits its most intense and practical roadblock. This is the great stopping power debate. An older rural shooter looks at a Ruger GP100 and sees absolute certainty. They know that if they have to pull the trigger on a rabid coyote, a feral hog, or a trespasser meaning to do harm, that single round carries enough kinetic energy and penetration to end the problem immediately. They trust the massive kinetic dump of the old-school cartridge. They believe that a heavy, slow-firing gun forces you to take your time and make your shots count. However, a younger shooter looks at that same heavy revolver and asks a very uncomfortable question. In the modern era, does stopping power still matter more than capacity? Think about the alternative. A modern polymer frame 9mm pistol weighs half as much, carries 15 to 17 rounds, has practically zero recoil, and takes 2 seconds to reload. If you are dealing with a pack of wild dogs near the barn, or multiple threats in the middle of the night, those 6 or 7 rounds in the Magnum are going to dry up extremely fast. Trying to push rounds into a hot cylinder with freezing hands in the dark is a nightmare compared to simply slamming a fresh magazine into a semi-automatic. Modern bullet technology has changed the game too. 20 years ago, the gap between a 9mm and a Magnum was massive, but today, modern defensive 9mm ammunition expands reliably and penetrates deeply, narrowing that gap significantly. So the younger guy argues that the massive power of the Magnum is overkill, and the extra capacity of the 9 is a much smarter insurance policy. But the old-timer will just shake his head and tell you that paper ballistics do not mean a thing when you have a 300-pound angry hog charging out of the brush. In that split second, you do not want an expanding 9mm. You want a heavy piece of lead that punches through thick bone and gristle without deflecting. That is the limitation you have to accept with these beautiful heavy revolvers. You are trading volume of fire for sheer impact. You are carrying 3 pounds of steel on your belt, which can drag your pants down and get caught on the tractor seat, all for 6 rounds of guaranteed power. It is a fantastic tool, but it requires you to be absolutely perfect with your shot placement because you do not have the luxury of missing. If you want a brand new Smith & Wesson 686, you are looking at a retail price of around $979, while the Ruger GP100 usually sits right around $908. Both are phenomenal pieces of heavy steel, but they still leave us wondering why the oldest generation of shooters refuses to abandon this caliber for a modern semi-automatic. To finally answer why the .37 Magnum still causes so many arguments, we have to look past the spec sheets and the ballistic gel tests. We have to look at the guns that defined the cartridge and the generation of men who carried them. This brings us to the absolute core of old-school confidence, embodied perfectly by 2 legendary firearms, the Ruger Blackhawk and the Smith & Wesson Model 19. These are not just firearms anymore. They are the physical representation of rural American identity. The Smith & Wesson Model 19 was the original combat Magnum. It was designed specifically at the request of legendary lawman Bill Jordan, who wanted a revolver that carried like a .38 but hit like a Magnum. It was built on the medium-sized K-frame, making it incredibly comfortable to wear on a gun belt all day long. It was the gun you had on your hip when you were out checking property lines, and you hardly even noticed the weight. On the other side of the fence, you have the Ruger Blackhawk. This is a single-action revolver, built like an absolute bank vault. It took the classic silhouette of the Old West cowboy gun and upgraded it with modern coil springs and incredibly strong steel, making it capable of handling the hottest hunting loads on the planet. But when you look at these 2 guns today, you have to confront the central question of this entire debate. Is carrying one of these older Magnums a practical choice for modern survival, or is it just stubborn old man confidence? The truth is, it is a little bit of both, and that is exactly why the argument will never end. If you take a Ruger Blackhawk into a modern defensive training class, you are going to get laughed at by the younger crowd. You are bringing a single-action, slow-loading, 6-shot cowboy gun to a world dominated by red dot sights, weapon lights, and extended magazines. Reloading a Blackhawk requires you to open a loading gate and punch out empty brass one agonizing casing at a time. If your hands are shaking from adrenaline, you are going to fumble. If you are carrying a vintage Model 19, you have to worry about the legendary forcing cone issue, where shooting too many lightweight, high-velocity Magnum rounds can actually crack the barrel over time. This means if you own one of these classics, you have to be smart about your ammo choices, sticking mostly to standard pressure loads or heavier grain Magnums to protect the gun. It is a gun that requires the owner to be educated about its mechanical limits, which is something a lot of folks who just want a plug-and-play appliance do not understand. These guns have real undeniable limitations. They demand a level of manual dexterity, mechanical sympathy, and marksmanship that most modern shooters simply do not want to bother learning. But here is why the older rural shooter does not care about any of those limitations. Their reality is not a tactical training class. Their reality is a lone farmhouse 30 minutes away from the closest sheriff deputy. Their reality is walking out to the barn at 2 in the morning in the freezing rain to see why the dogs are barking. In that environment, they do not want a gun that relies on battery-powered optics, sensitive magazine feed lips, or specific recoil spring tensions to cycle properly. They want a piece of old steel that operates on pure, undeniable mechanical certainty. The confidence they have in the .357 Magnum is born from decades of seeing it work when things get dirty, wet, and simple. A single-action revolver forces you to be deliberate. You cannot panic and dump a magazine into the dirt. You have to thumb that hammer back, align those heavy iron sights, and commit to the shot. It is a mindset that cannot be bought in a store. It has to be earned through years of walking the woods and working the land. It is a philosophy of ownership that says you only need 6 rounds if you know exactly what you are doing with them. A Ruger Blackhawk can sit in a leather holster in the cab of a pickup truck through a 100-degree summer and a 0-degree winter, gathering dust and completely ignored, and the moment you pull the hammer back, it will fire. It does not care if the ammunition is perfectly clean. It does not care if you have a limp wrist when you pull the trigger. It is a machine that refuses to fail. That old man confidence is not ignorance. It is a deep, profound trust in a system that has proven itself over a lifetime of hard labor. The younger generation focuses heavily on what happens if you miss, which is why they want capacity. But the older generation focuses entirely on making sure they do not miss, which is why they want a trigger they know intimately and a bullet that leaves no doubt. They know that in rural spaces, engagements are usually fast, close, and over in just a few seconds. If a mountain lion drops out of a tree or a rabid animal charges you by the tractor, you are not going to be doing tactical reloads. You are going to draw, fire once or twice, and the problem will be resolved one way or the other. In that chaotic moment, the massive concussive roar and bone-crushing impact of the Magnum is exactly what they want on their side. These guns are a bridge to a time when things were built to be passed down. You can still find brand new Ruger Blackhawks with a retail price of around $959, and while Smith Wesson has reintroduced the Model 19 in their classic line for about $999, the used market is full of originals that still lock up perfectly tight after 40 years of use. They hold their value because they hold our trust. We have looked at the expensive Safe Queens, the punishing carry guns, the lever actions, and the heavy-duty revolvers. But ultimately, the .357 Magnum argument always comes back to the exact same rural reality. It is not about whether a modern semi-automatic holds more rounds. The real question is what kind of machine you want in your hand when the weather is miserable and you only get one chance to solve a problem on your property. For a younger generation, the answer is high capacity. But for the older shooter, the answer is still old steel, a heavy bullet, and absolute mechanical certainty. That old man confidence was not bought in a store. It was earned out in the brush over decades of hard use. .357 Magnum still starts arguments because it forces us to choose between the volume of fire we think we might need and the raw stopping power we know actually works. So where do you draw the line? Are you willing to give up the capacity of a modern 9mm for the guaranteed impact of a Magnum? Or has the world simply moved past the 6-shooter? If you're watching from the living room couch, pull out your phone, open up the YouTube app, and let me know your thoughts in the comments. Stay safe, stay informed, and I'll see you in the next one. This is Gunforge, signing off.